Hi, everyone who's joining right now. We're just letting some people in, and we'll give, I think, a couple more minutes for people to join. Cool. Okay. I'm Hannah. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for joining and being here on time. Also on the call is Tara, who's helping out from Terra Do, making sure that people are coming in and joining the call. Today's session is about how to create and pivot into an impact career. I'm keeping today quite broad, so it won't just be climate, we'll be looking at impact more broadly as well. But obviously climate will be used a lot as examples here. I can also see the chat, so feel free to share and say hi and ask questions as we go along, though there will be opportunities later. But let's get going. First off, it would be great to know where you are joining from, just so I have an idea. So there's people from all over Europe, but I've been hearing that in other sessions there's people joining from the US, from Asia. So if you can share what city, that would give me some idea also what examples to use and some of the resources to share. Okay, we're getting a lot coming in. We've got Sweden, Amsterdam, lots from Amsterdam, Berlin. Hi, everyone from Berlin. We've got London, Seattle, Washington, D.C., Barcelona. Cool. I'm joining actually not from a big city. I'm joining from a tiny village in the Scottish Highlands. So hopefully the internet holds out. Okay, so today we've got a lot to get through. I wanted to start first with what On Purpose is, because they are the co-host of the session. On Purpose it's a program that runs for a year, and it supports professionals who are transitioning into purpose-driven, impactful careers. What it involves is it's pretty intense in terms of commitment, but it involves leaving your current role and looking at this associate program, which you'll join for a year. The best bit about it is that you actually get paid during the process, and you'll do generally two placements with different impact organizations. There's also training, and it equips and gives skills for people who are transitioning into impact and often into climate careers. They run programs in Berlin, they run programs in London, and I've done training sessions in the past for them. So this talk today is part of a session that I delivered a year ago. It's a great program. I think the best resources are online if you want to dive into that. And they're also running a couple of other sessions during this week. So I also wanted to share a little bit about me. I'm Hannah Wicks, and I'm a board executive for a few nonprofit and startups. I also am a founder advisor, so I work with really early stage entrepreneurs, largely in the climate tech space. I also work as a career coach, which is a lot of what you're going to hear today is actually coming from sessions that I frequently do one-on-one with people who are navigating really big change. They're switching countries, they're switching sectors, they're switching huge life moments, and they're looking to find employment, but also purpose along the way. So it's a lot of that work that I'll bring to today's session. I often work with senior leaders, but also junior people as they kind of navigate and want to pivot into new areas. And my role is to kind of help organizations as well as the employees within it as they kind of transform and seek to be more impactful. So I wanted to start right at the beginning. How do you even start this process? Some of you might be further along than others. So some of you might already be in climate or in an impact role, but wanting to find a position with more purpose or wanting to find a way to grow your skill set. And how do you actually have impact, and how do you measure it? I wanted to start with one of the first questions you should ask yourself and use a personal example. It's around lived experience. And it's a phrase that comes up all the time in nonprofits and charities. They're often looking to hire people with lived experience in the areas they work in. But I want you to think back to your own lived experience. What have you done in your life? Where were you born? What evolved? What experiences do you have? I've shared two photos here. One is my lived experience. I grew up in Devon in the UK. There are a lot of fields. It's a very regional area. And my understanding of nature and climate was very informed by growing up with access to green space, but also in a community that was quite under-resourced when it came to education opportunities, for example. So my lived experience is quite a rural one. I also then, at the age of 12, moved to Australia and moved to Outback Australia. This is Tabletop Mountain, not the South African Tabletop Mountain. It is a very regional area and way wilder. And there are also things that are in my lived experience like this, which is bushfires and wildfires. And so my understanding of climate came quite young when my family was evacuated when I was 13 in the face of a bushfire. And when you're starting to look for threads in your career, you really want to look at early. Think about your childhood. Go right back to the first kind of formative experiences where you notice things, when you notice nature, when you noticed environment. And you want to start reflecting on that because there might be the beginnings of career thread and transition for you. Once you've done that kind of first exploration, which is around your formative kind of memories and experiences, you then want to look at hard skills. And on a personal level, for me, what this looked like was moving from a regional area into radio. So one of the few ways that the regional areas that I grew up in Australia were connected were radio. Other forms of technology weren't as reliable. So I ended up working for the ABC, like the BBC, and I started in social media, and then I started working in music radio. And these were hard skills I picked up along the way. So if you're looking to transition into an impact career, you want to look at those first jobs that you had, those first experiences that you had. What were the hard skills? When it came to radio, it was running big music events. It was running outside broadcasts. I actually picked up social media skills along the way because you couldn't really get an audience for radio anymore if you weren't tweeting, if you weren't on Instagram. So these were some of the hard skills I picked up that outside of probably the degree and study I'd done. And the other piece, you're probably wondering why the Trivago woman is on there. For me, one of the areas I moved into, and I was actually looking to get into nonprofit and climate, but I got roadblocked. I was really struggling to find roles. And what was growing at that point in time was tech. And I was like, okay, I can still learn here. Social media is very, very similar to radio. I'll be a social media manager. And so I ended up moving to Dusseldorf. It wasn't in the agenda or plan, and working for a company called Trivago. One of the things about this pivot, which was unexpected and not planned, one of the big things about that pivot is the hard skills it gave me. It gave me business development skills. It gave me understanding of how companies scale and how they interact with policy makers and regulators as they disrupt. So one of the things when you are looking at having an impact career is to go, firstly, where were my formative experiences? What are my lived experiences? Then what are some of the hard skills I've picked up in those earlier roles I've had? What did they involve? And really like name them as hard skills. Okay, I run events. I know how to read a spreadsheet. I know how to book a TV ad. I didn't know that when I started. I learned it on the job. These kind of skills are really important and can be used in that impact and climate transition. Everyone will have a different kind of audit of skills here. What I did next is the interesting thing, because I hit a point where I was like, oh, okay, this is fun, but I kind of put companies on a traffic light kind of rating. And Trivago, well-known brand, it was a good company, it was scaling and growing, but it was orange. It wasn't doing huge harm, but it wasn't doing huge good either. It looked after its employees, it had a strong culture, but it didn't do what I wanted it to do. I wanted ambitious climate, and I wanted to be able to have a role within that. So I looked for earlier stage companies that were smaller than Trivago, but still growing. So I went one scale back and found a company called Ecosia. And Ecosia is a search engine that uses all of its profits for tree planting and landscape restoration. This is where they are now. When I joined, they were small. They weren't massive. And this is one of the things, if you're looking to move into climate, particularly into climate tech, look at earlier stage startups if you're transitioning into these roles. what happened at that point was taking some of the media skills, these hard skills I mentioned around running events, being able to book a TV ad, knowing how social media worked, and applying it to a new context, which was trees and nature and movement building. And a lot of that interview process with Ecosia, where I ended up being CMO for 5 years, that interview process focused on those hard skills. And one thing I found repeatedly in impact roles, and a lot of this happens even when I'm working with clients as they transition into more kind of focused climate careers, they're not often asked about climate and their knowledge of climate. And people often are like, I have to study, I have to relearn all these skills. You do have to have knowledge, but why you are being hired is usually around the hard skills. So knowing your hard skills and being able to reposition them for this new environment that you're about to walk into is key. And it was key to this transition for me into a climate space. So what you're looking for here is threads. And I just shared this artwork because for me, the threads often don't make sense. They're often knotted. And you're like, how does this all connect? It doesn't look like a career path. And most of us in that late high school or maybe in university, when we're doing those kind of like, what are you going to be when you grow up, when you're getting those early stage career sessions, are told careers are like a ladder. They're not like a ladder. They're a thread. And there's probably multiple threads that you have right now from those formative lived experiences, from those first kind of roles and the hard skills that you had that are there that can be used and repositioned for impact and also climate work. So you want to, when you're navigating a big change, a big role change, or looking for new roles, you want to find your threads. And there's probably several, which is the good news. There's several. The bad news is it can take time to unknot them and figure them out and make it not just coherent to you, but coherent to people who are going to hire you. Okay, and this is the final kind of question to ask yourselves. You've asked yourself about what's my lived experience? What are my hard skills? The next one is, do you have community? And where is that community and is it quite tangible? Shifting careers can be very lonely. Job hunting can be very lonely. They're often done solo. One of the big things about moving into an impact space or the climate space in general is that it's a movement. There are big communities around this, and you want to find the local version if you can. For me, when I was looking to leave Ecosia and start working in a fractional way with different companies, I needed to find community again. And that involved going to a place called Refugio in Berlin. If you're in Berlin, I highly advise going there. And every Wednesday, they do a big cooking session. And for me, that was like, okay, this reconnects me with people, it reconnects me with food and the topics around food scarcity and belonging. And it enabled me to create a habit of turning up and connecting with other people while a lot of my other life was in huge change and confusion. This piece was consistent. So one key thing, ask yourself, do I have community and am I connecting with it regularly? And it may feel like this feels like a waste of time. I'm not hunting for jobs. I didn't apply for anything today. But if you can turn up somewhere where it feels very tangible and very human, it creates a sense of safety that allows you to navigate the rest. And for me, this was pretty transformational in the moment of change. I don't work in food, and that hasn't been something that's opened up as a career path, but it is something that grounded me in that moment of transition. Okay, so in summary, if you were to write down 3 questions to take away today, it's these 3. What's your lived experience? Everyone has one. What are your hard skills? Usually everyone has several hard skills. And do you have community that can support you? Not necessarily around what you want to do and what you want to navigate into. It's very easy to network and join groups around careers, but they're hungry communities. Everyone's looking for something. You want to find a community that can nurture you in a very different way to balance out the stress of a career shift into impact. So that's the 3. Okay, that's part 1. Part 2, identifying your impact focus. The other thing that happens a lot when I'm doing career coaching and when I'm working with people in the climate space and people who want to move into that space is you keep it very broad. I want to work in climate. It's great. But what does that mean? What is the actual impact that you want to have, and how do you find it? Because if you keep it at the climate level, it gets quite hard to focus on. So I wanted to move us into an activity because I've been A, talking for a while, and B, it's probably more entertaining. I wanted to go back to look at that lived experience piece again. Either you can pick the first moment you became aware of climate change. For me, it was that bushfire moment. I mean, it's a very strong moment. It was an extreme climate event. But what's the first moment you became aware of it? And maybe it's more recent. Or you can pick a childhood moment that has stuck with you, a moment when you were really happy as a kid, where you were like, yeah, I love this. Most times when I'm saying that, you'll have something that's popped into your head. Don't overanalyze it, just go with that first one. Now, if possible, I have a piece of paper, but if you don't have paper, feel free to write this down. But if you have physical paper, I want us to take 2 minutes to start drawing that moment where you discovered climate change. You don't have to share these pictures. This is fine if you cannot draw. Or the childhood moment. Start drawing it, start sketching it. So it'll give us 2 minutes from now. Okay, go. Feel free to put in as much detail as you need, but no words yet if you're drawing this. If you need to go get paper, that's also fine. Okay, just finish up the drawing if you can. Any final details? It's just a sketch. Mine is not good artwork right now. Cool. Now I just want you to have a look at the paper and look at what you've drawn. Think about the feelings that you have while you're looking at this. And if there are any words for the emotions, write them down over the picture. So looking at that image, what's the most basic feeling it gives you? The most basic emotion if you were to give it a really simple word. If some of the words that you're writing down are quite negative, what would be the opposite of that word? So for example, this is terrible. I have a burning house image from my bushfire. My house did not burn down. And one of the words I've written down is fear. But the opposite word for that would be safety, in my case. Cool. If you've got 2 to 3 words, that's probably enough for the moment. Just circle them, note them down. Now, if you have a couple of words that you would like to share, feel free to add them into the chat. It will be a bit random without context. But yeah, thank you for sharing. Getting freedom and free come up quite a lot, which is always something in here. Got justice, peace, magnitude, opportunity, hope. Keep writing them in. Now, most of us have an idea in our head of where our career is at, or what would be the most easy path to go down. If the right doors opened up, I could do X. I want you to forget that right now. Put it aside. What's something that you could do career-wise? It might take huge change. It might take restudying or doing something similar. What's something that you could do or work in that relates directly to that memory? What's a role, an area of work, or a startup or an idea that you could do to help solve that topic? It looks like I'm joining the emergency fire brigade, but feel free to get more creative than that. It also doesn't have to be full-time work. It could be volunteering work, could be something similar. Feel free to also add them into the chat. Cool. Okay. That was just a bit of a deep dive. If it was one-on-one coaching, we'd be going fully in, but I want us to sprint through a few different types of activities today. One of the biggest aspects of navigating a big career change, especially into an impact area, is self-reflection, because you can end up working in climate, but actually not finding your purpose, which is I've seen happen before with several clients where despite being in a climate role, they're not happy. And it's because you often have to find these threads of purpose and values and then find the work. And if it doesn't connect to your purpose, but you're doing climate work, it can burn you out quite quickly. So if there is a career thread that came up, and I think some of you are already sharing them in there, feel free to keep sharing with the group. So I wanted to talk a little bit, a personal example of following a career thread. This wasn't intentional when I set out. A lot of career threads you don't realize until it's retrospective, that it's there, that it's a thread, that it's something consistent that's been happening in different ways throughout your life. So here's an example. So I told you at the age of 12, I moved to regional Australia, very regional Australia. It's a town called Toowoomba. It's in the Great Dividing Range. It's not the beaches. It's around 100,000, but I was just outside to the point like it's properly off grid. We didn't have connected mains water kind of grid. And one of the things they did with this big town is focus on it being a centre for new Australians to arrive. And that included, in the wake of the crisis in Darfur, a lot of Sudanese Australians. And Toowoomba became an example of this. And at the age of 13, I was matched with someone who was my age, who was from Darfur. And we did English language tutoring together over several months. And it was one of those formative life moments where I was like, oh, not everyone has had quite the life I've had. And when people move to Australia, not everyone has it as easy as I had on that move. And it was a moment that kind of stuck with me, but it wasn't a moment that became a big part of my career. But this interest in belonging, which is something that I kind of identified later as what it was about, what creates a sense of belonging to a community, what connects people to a community, and what gives someone the right welcome to feel a sense of belonging somewhere. And so this was a thread that came up in my life very early. What happened when I moved to Europe was seeing the shift around refugee topics. If anyone knows Australia, we know that we don't have a great record on refugees and asylum seekers. And it was something that had come up when I was a journalist in Australia. And then when I moved to Europe, I saw the UK was starting to copy the Australian kind of policy on refugees and the way they talked about people and the rhetoric of stop the boats. And I was like, not again. Here we go again. What could I do as a person working in comms with experience in communications and marketing to support this? And for me, the thread then came when I joined an organization who I'd started donating to, called the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. And I saw myself living in Europe as a migrant. And I was like, who else is having experiences like this? And so I started donating there, and then they were looking for trustees. And I was like, great. And then they were like, actually, we're looking for people with climate experiences, because right now, the term refugee doesn't include someone who is a climate refugee. So you're only a refugee under international law if you're fleeing conflict-related instances, and if you've crossed borders for that reason. So there is no such thing as a climate refugee. So one thing JCWI is working on is the definition of climate refugee. They're a legal aid charity, and they're looking to define that in law, which will have massive impact on whether or not people can move and whether there's safe passages for movement. So to give an example of a thread, it started at 13 with my own movement across countries, and then seeing that it wasn't as easy for others on that same journey, and then picking that up throughout career. And this is the other thing about climate and trying to find what your definition of climate is it's quite an intersectional space. So one thing I wanted to kind of focus on, and we've done this a little bit before, is what if you didn't need to earn money? What if people couldn't laugh at what you chose to do? What would you look at? What kind of climate solution area most intrigues you? What intersectional area joining your interests comes to mind? For me, it was, oh, I actually really care about this specific aspect of climate justice. It's a big question. So if you haven't got something off the top of your head, or if you haven't got something you want to share, feel free to take this question for later. But if there's something specific that intrigues you around climate, that interests you, that's quite like a specific area, feel free to add it in the chat. We've got a few coming in. We've got some on clothing that self-clean and don't need water or chemicals that pollute water. We've got one related to singing and bringing communities together through song. We've got solar energy, health of marine ecosystems. We've got taking oil companies to court and taking away their power. We've got some on degrowth. There's probably going to be several of these that you have. There'll be one strong one that comes to mind, but the thing with career threads is that you usually have lots of them. And so you want to see if you can dig them out and reflect on them, and then figure out, okay, what would be a way into that if I want to take it forward as an area that I want to have impact and to work in. We've got designing cities, natural-based solutions. There's a really interesting question in here. If you're more of a generalist and you don't have that clear one way or the other way, I would say do several. You don't have to go down one path really hard. We do need generalists in this space. My skills and expertise sit on the marketing, comms, and kind of business development side. So I apply it to the climate migration place because I find that interesting, but I don't work full time in it. I work in that in a pro bono way. I also work with another organization called Creators for Climate as an advisor, because I really find creatives and PR and how this whole world is messaged really interesting. Again, it's not all of my work. So you can find a way to work across different topics or to volunteer into those spaces. Cool. We've already mentioned this, but I mean, the SDGs is there's a lot of thought and comment on this, but it's an interesting place to start when you're thinking about the intersection of different issues. And if there's one or two of these that really stand out to you as something that's interesting, oh, I'm way more interested in health and well-being and its intersection with climate. Or actually, I'm more interested in marine ecosystems and climate. So even if you have generalist skill set, see which one of these, if you were to rank them, is most intriguing to you. What are you curious about? What would you spend time researching, even if someone didn't pay you? A little bit of time reflecting there can help. So starting with the SDGs is one way. The other, there's a resource called Project Drawdown. A lot of you, if you're interested in climate, will know this resource, but they have a lot on emissions. So you can also approach this from actually what's putting the most amount of carbon into the atmosphere right now, and what's actually taking out of the atmosphere, where are the carbon sinks, and figuring out, okay, I want to work on that one, or I'm interested in that one. So you can also evaluate it from an impact perspective directly with carbon. Okay. Part 3 is really looking at defining your values. If we go back to what we did earlier around your kind of core skills that you kind of have from childhood all the way through, they might help inform your values. But generally, when I work with someone and do career coaching with them, we try and get to a point where you maybe have 5 values. There's hundreds of values out there. They can be defined in many ways. And there is no one source of truth when it comes to values. We're often used to encountering corporate values, which can feel a bit hollow and meaningless. So when you go about the process of defining your personal values, particularly in the context of work, you want to create your own definitions. You don't want to use definition just from the online dictionary. And you also want to see if you can have values that support each other. They're almost like tent pegs. They can't be all focused on people and impact, because there's other values which will need to be held down in order to balance that one. So see values in a way like a tent peg. You want to make sure you have all the corners covered. So how do you define them? I think you go back, like I said, to the early parts of your career. This is an easy way to start sifting, because most of us have had positive and negative work experiences. Even in a job you loved, there's probably some moments where you're like, I just really hated that project, or that was really, really tough working with that team, or I really have to find a way out of this. A lot of you might be on this call because you're currently finding some aspect of your work a little bit draining and you're wanting to shift. So for this activity, I want you to get ready to time travel. So looking back at your past work experiences, we're going to try and figure out your work values. So this one, same again, use paper, or if you want notes on your computer, think about your past work experiences. No need to kind of think, oh, this one or that one, whichever one you like and comes to mind. Write 3 things down from your past work experiences that you've loved, that you've absolutely gone, that was the best moments I've ever had turning up for work. I really enjoyed it. And that brought a lot of fulfillment. And they can be a project you worked on. They can be a colleague that you connect with. They don't have to be the job itself. So if just a minute and a half, maybe, to write down 3, maybe a couple of minutes. While you're thinking of those experiences, if there's specific words that stand out, I really love the people on that project, or I like the impact of that, or I like that I could give a voice to people in that one. So if there's any specific words that are coming out as you're thinking of those 3 experiences that you really loved, underline them, circle them, highlight them. Okay. Now we're going to switch to the negative experiences. And I don't want you to go too deep into it because it can be a real downer. But have there been things that you haven't liked at work where you're like, I can't wait for this to finish up, or I need to get out of this role? What was it about that experience? What was actually draining you in those moments? Was it the conflict? Was it the lack of focus? Or was it the rules? Too many rules? So write down 2 to 3 things from past work experiences that have been quite negative. I saw someone sneeze on the call. Bless you. You had your mic off. It's all good. Cool. Those 2 to 3 words that you might have down, taking those negative ones, what's the positive opposite of that? What's the opposite word? If it was something about the culture of the company or the work that you didn't like, what would it look like if it was good? What would be the word to describe that? Cool. So what you've done here is identify some of the potential work values that you have. And you want to keep track of them. It might not be your final work values, but these are things that you can look for in future roles. What's interesting is you probably have also identified a lot of needs, things that you need. It might be flexibility, for example, or it might be a type of management style that you're looking for. And when people move into impact or climate or look to grow in that area, they often don't think about those needs, and it can lead to frustration later down the line. So you want to make sure that you're not compromising on those core values in order to work in climate. Ideally, they come together and there's alignment there, but not always. If you feel like sharing a few of those words or values, feel free to do so in the chat. I just wanted to share here, we're not going to dive into it, but generally when I will work with someone who's going through this process, you really want to collect values. You want that reflection activity. And over time go, okay, what are companies who actually match them, that I think match them? Patagonia is nearly always #1, so get more adventurous. Other companies that you think might have these values. I'll share a few resources for finding them later, but I also have just screenshot here a list of the values that I work with generally. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of potential values you can have, and you need to sift down and find the one that's maybe the root cause. I thought I wanted flexibility, and that was one of my main values. I actually wanted freedom, and which is more the root value behind flexibility. And there's various reasons for that, but you want to really sift so you can find the best definition for you, and they can change over time. Another way to identify your work values, and I'm going to leave these as activities for you to do separate from this call, is really think about what brings calm. Where do you feel most at rest, at peace? Work doesn't need to be stressful. And if you find a space that you're calm in, that actually refuels you, you'll be able to have a lot more long-term impact. So for me, it was actually being in nature. And one of the reasons I applied for Ecosia was not necessarily climate. It was, I just liked trees. I really liked being in forests. I'd spent a lot of time as kids on walks in forests. And I was like, I actually just love trees. I think they're really cool. And for me, that was actually one of the decisions and motivations behind me applying for that work. So you have to think about what is the calm. So remembering like this childhood I'd had, I actually found a way to get back to it. It's one of the reasons I'm coming to you from a Highland village right now. But this piece is really what brings you calm, what brings you peace. And if you can spend a bit of time reflecting on that. It can take you to interesting places as well. So for me, I also got with Ecosia, I ended up going to Uganda. So I applied some of those skills. I took a group of journalists to Jane Goodall's project in Uganda, and managed to look at climate change on the ground and how it was really impacting chimpanzee habitats. And this kind of work was not something I woke up expecting to do, but it is somewhere where it led me when I followed the calm, when I followed the piece that actually was genuinely where I felt most at rest. So for me, I actually found it was nature-based solutions is the area where I like working on climate comms quite a lot, as well as climate justice and sense of belonging for people. The other way to find your values, and this is another question you can do in a separate reflection activity, is the opposite of calm. What brings a sense of outrage? What do you think is actually outrageous? Like, this just shouldn't be happening this way. There are these areas. For me, having worked in journalism and then in marketing and comms and worked in PR as well, placing stories with journalists, I found it outrageous that fossil fuel companies could greenwash and do it legally. That big PR companies were still working with them, that they hadn't been pressured to drop these clients. And that for me was one of the reasons I ended up working with Creators for Climate. It's also one of the reasons I really like working or supporting as an individual organizations like Client Earth who push for legal challenges. I think someone said that on the chat, wanting to work in that space of actually challenging fossil fuel companies legally. So this I found absolutely outrageous. It is something also to balance though. If you work in an area where you feel a sense of rage sometimes, and if you're looking at systems change, sometimes that can happen, it can be exhausting. And so you will need to navigate this space and make sure that you're not almost like having a traumatic work experience every day. It is an area though to discover your values. So sometimes when you're outraged by something, it's because it's very, very counter to your values. So if you spend time reflecting what outrages me, especially in climate and impact, you can come up with stuff that actually is a path forward. It might be somewhere where you actually are like, I want to work on that some of the time, or I want to work on that later in my career where I feel more resilient and more on top of it. But it's another way to discover, do self-discovery. Yeah, so for me, it led me to Creators for Climate, which is a great community. If you want to join, it's like 40,000 people working on creativity and how to use it for good and how to not use it for fossil fuels and the continuation of some of the challenges we have around that. They have a course on anti-greenwashing and how to support the organization you might be currently in not greenwashing. So that one is, I think, a really good resource if you want to look at that space, especially around comms and visual communication. How I use values. So I wanted to share my own values. How I use them now, because I'm not working in-house at one company, I use them to pick clients and who I'm going to work with and who I might not work with. So there's one group of values I have around belonging, and this piece of wanting to feel or help a sense of belonging for communities. It's related, probably deep psychological stuff on my side. And this is the thing, your values are coming from something quite formative. The other piece I have is around curiosity and creativity. For me, these two are joined. And I thought at first one of my values was learning. I was like, I like learning new things. I always like picking new topics. And I was like, no, actually, the value is curiosity. I'm just quite curious. There's a point where I want to pivot to the next topic. So I don't deep dive learning on one topic forever. So I then switched to what actually about impact. And for me, these two are linked. It was about equity. It was about how do we have more equity? And so for me, that's a big thread within the work on climate that I do. Ideally, you get down to between 3 to 5 values, and it can help you make decisions around your next kind of career path. And also you can look at companies and when you're interviewing there to evaluate their values against your own, because you can have a real mismatch, even if they do great work. Okay, so in the last 15 minutes, I really want to focus on, but okay, this is all well and good, but how do you actually pivot your career? How do you actually shift into a different area, especially into climate, if you're not currently working in climate? And what does that look like? And what are some of those skills? Firstly, I wanted to look at how you reposition your skills. The first thing that is really there is around language. And this is something that I see a lot. I do quite a lot of hiring in this space, is people not using the language of that organization or that sector. They have the raw skills. They have the hard skills. An example would be in nonprofits, they don't call it marketing usually. They call it communications. And they are slightly different, this is true. But the way you frame it in your CV, in your cover letter, even in your LinkedIn, if you're looking to pivot, you have to start using the language of the sector that you want to move into. It might be that the area of work that you do, let's say you work in sales or have worked in sales for a lot of your career, in business development, sales, you're really good at that people connection. What that looks like in nonprofits, or what that looks like in B Corps, might be partnerships. So you want to see if you can pivot and start using wording around that. What did that partnership look like that you navigated? That long-term sales relationship or account management role that you did? In nonprofits, business development is often called fundraising. It's a different skill, and you really need to know how to fundraise with foundations or direct donations, but it's the same core skill set. So a lot of pivoting is about the language. So really delving in job descriptions, how are they talking about it? Are there other words that might be used? Some things do say the same. So someone who's working in human resources at BP can probably work in human resources at a climate company. They might hit a bit of a wall in terms of the authenticity of that switch, but the skills are largely the same. Finance and accounting are also quite similar. So there's areas where that you're not going to have to pivot to the same extreme. But some is a question of just a little change on the language. So to reposition your skills, you need to learn the new language. And every factor of climate, whether it's climate hardware, tech companies, whether it's nature-based solutions, they often have a new language. They'll have acronyms. They'll have a whole type of news media just devoted to them, and they'll have thought leaders. So you want to familiarize yourself with that new language because it will help during the interview process. The other thing you want to do is quantify your past impact. So often organizations that are growing in the climate space are looking to understand how your skills can help them develop their organization and their impact. So can you quantify what you've done? How many people have you managed? What's the size of maybe the budget or the resources that you've had? What's the kind of big partnerships or projects that you've been working on? And what's the scale of them in a kind of quantifiable way that would relate to that organization? It's one of the number one things when I review CVs that people forget to do is to put in the numbers, especially when they're looking at impact roles. They'll talk about all the themes of the work, but they won't talk about the numbers behind the work and what the impact was. And it's a big factor for getting the role or not. The other is to share your personal career threads, because as much as they want to hear the numbers and they want to hear you talk in the language, and they'll try and be accessible with the language, but not always, you want to share your origin stories and what your motivation is. And the earlier you start with that motivation and the way you can consistently talk about that thread, the better. And that has a big impact on whether or not you can form a rapport with the organization and whether or not they think you understand the work that they're doing. The other thing to reposition is to volunteer in that space that you want to get into. It doesn't have to be every week. It could be working with an organization for a weekend. It could be doing online volunteering. It is, for me, I volunteered when I was out of work, moving from Australia to Europe with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which in the UK is the #1 charity focused on conservation in terms of members. I did it for 3 months. I did their social media accounts. And it's one of the reasons I ended up being able to get the role at Ecosia, because I could talk around climate and building communities around nature. So those 3 months, though unpaid, came back to me in a big way. So can you find those kind of career threads, amplify them with some volunteering, especially if at your disposal you have time? It's tough if you don't have time. The other thing is prototype conversations. Can you have them? So who is doing the job that you want or working in the impact area that you think you maybe want to go into? Can you have coffee with them? Can you ask them? Can you just listen to a podcast with them? Understand what they do and then figure out, actually, is it for me? Is it in line with those values that I have? And that will save a considerable amount of time as you pivot. The last part, there was a question, I think, earlier on this, but around the portfolio of impact. How do you build out a portfolio? Because you can have your day job, but how do you go beyond that? Firstly, there's what can you do as an employee in your current role? How can you advocate for climate internally? Is there a group looking at climate? Is there a sustainability officer? If there's not, who's covering that? What's leadership saying about climate? Every organization is now a climate organization. Some are doing a great job, others are not. So you can advocate internally with this. The other areas, if you are working in a set field, are there climate groups in that field? I recently did a talk for UX designers, and it was 150 UX designers who are passionate around climate. And they were looking at ways to bring that design thinking skills to climate. So find other people who do the job that you do, but are passionate about this intersection with climate. It also really helps not feeling alone as you shift. The other is to kind of develop your skills. You can do that sometimes on the company clock. So you can use your professional development budget if you have one, for climate courses, for research, for coaching. All of these things can help. Also to build out your kind of portfolio of impact, this volunteering piece. If you're able to bring it in, it can be a big sacrifice of time, but if it's possible to do it, it can kind of fulfill some of that need you have to do things quickly. You can start going, okay, I'm going to take my time to find the right fit, but I'm already starting to have a small impact here. There's also nonprofit board roles. They're another whole thing to go down, but in my experience, people don't look at becoming a trustee or joining a board because they feel they're not senior enough. And actually, if you have hard skills around marketing, finance, business development, partnerships, HR, they need you. And it's a good way to learn about impact. So looking at climate organizations, social justice organizations, there's a lot of roles advertised in that space, and most of those organizations are looking to have active climate strategies. The other option is to go fractional in your career. You can scale your impact, so you work with a few different organizations and look to bring in more climate-related pieces of work. Cool. That was a lot. So if there are questions that you have, feel free to add them to the chat. I have prepped 3 questions that I often get asked with some resources. So as the questions come in, feel free to also follow along with this. Where are the job opportunities? Like, where are these jobs actually being advertised? How do I find a climate-related job? Where is it? They are advertised a lot on the normal job boards that you see, but there's a few sites that I recommend. One is called Escape the City, particularly useful for global roles and UK roles. It's for Escape the City, and city means kind of finance. Escape the City, escape corporate life. They have a lot of roles, and you can filter based on the area of impact you're interested in. They also have a whole remote section. Green Jobs Board, particularly good if you work in the US or can work on North American time. There's Charity Job, which has a lot of global charity jobs and UK charity jobs. There is Ethical Jobs, that's an Australian job site, but they cover a lot of regions. If you're interested in board roles, I highly recommend Dynamic Boards. They advertise non-executive director ones, which are paid, and volunteer pro bono roles. And you can subscribe to that one for free, because a lot of those more senior board roles are behind paywalls. And then lastly, this isn't a job board, but B Corps. There's now 9,000 of them. They're companies that want to mix purpose and profit. This is the huge list. It's hard to find on the B Corp site, but you can search by location and then find the companies who are B Corps in your country. And then follow them on LinkedIn, start looking out the jobs there. It's a messy way to do it. I hope they get a really active jobs board soon. Okay, so that's one in terms of where to find the jobs. This one, do I need to study again? It comes up a lot. I don't think you do need to study again. There are courses you can do like Terra Do. There's programs you can do like On Purpose if you really want to devote time and focus. You can also look to do shorter courses, like the UN has a number of courses that then also sit very well in terms of CV. You can look at learning around climate and investing. There's good certifications in that. There are online masters now offered, particularly from UK universities. So there are opportunities to really upskill. But in my experience, you're often wanting to find out what you want to do rather than actually doing it because you want to know. So people often use courses and studying as a stalling technique to do self-discovery, which is totally fine. But generally, you are qualified enough already to start working in impact. And then the final one I had was, how do I stay hopeful? Job hunting and pivoting into an area of career in impact is exhausting. And you're like, I just want to do good work, but no one's hiring me. 3 things. 1, spend time reflecting. What's working, what's not? Is the time you're putting in on applying for jobs paying off? Is it better to do networking? Spend some time reflecting. If you can, have a practice of doing that, whether it's journaling every day or something similar. The other one is to connect. Find your community, like I said. It doesn't have to be related to your career, but find something tangible. And the other one is to start mapping different paths. So this connection piece, like I said, mapping, it's something I do in career coaching, but it's best to not just have one 5-year plan, to have 3, because then you don't panic if one doesn't work out. It's a lot of work to do that, but it really helps make you feel like it's not going to all fall apart. And don't forget the threads. Cool. I can also see if this resource can be shared out with you. I also do free coaching taster calls for people who want to do that and look at doing this process over more time. And I've got some resources there as well. In terms of questions, let me see if there's a few in there. I shared, so Dynamic Boards has a list of trustee vacancies. There's also charity job in the UK. Yes, someone's asked about LinkedIn for jobs. There are a lot of jobs on LinkedIn, that's true. One tip I use for clients when I work with them is use the post search. Don't look for jobs, look for posts. And look for words like climate and hiring, because that's usually employees posting about climate work. And that's a way better understanding of the role. And there's often roles that aren't advertised. Let me see if there's any others. There is going to be a recording of the presentation. So that will go out to everyone who I think put attendance down. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Tara. And yes, also feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to talk further about climate careers, and I have more resources I can share. There's a few that will be in here. Project Drawdown's a great place to start. I have a newsletter that I send out every month or so, collecting roles and courses and opportunities. There's also a book called Designing Your Life, which helps plan and map out different futures for yourself. And then I also do the tasting calls if you want to do a session. And finally, I also wanted to say thanks to On Purpose, because they're the ones who are facilitating and helping out with this coaching as well for people who are transitioning. So if you're interested in their program, it is a year long, so it's a big commitment, but they'll be doing some sessions and explainer sessions in the coming months. Each cohort has between, I think, 10 and 20 people. And so you do the journey with other people who are transitioning into impact. Cool. And I think there's a few other resources in the chat. Feel free to also add in your LinkedIn and connect with each other. Cool. Okay. Thank you so much. I think we're 1 minute off.